What's going on, guys? Lon here from Android Authority, and Samsung just released another device into their A series lineup that's bigger, more powerful, and thinner, but is it worth the buy? This is the Samsung Galaxy A8. So this year, Samsung finally decided to completely ditch the use of plastic, going all in with more premium materials and a new design for their smartphones, and the Galaxy A8 continues that trend. Just like previous Samsung A series devices, the A8 utilizes a metal unibody design and continues Samsung's move away from practical features like removable batteries in favor of a better build quality. Chamfered edges go around the entire metal frame, and the body has been mostly rounded off along the corners and back, with the exception of the sides featuring some very prominent angles. At only 5.9mm thick, this is Samsung's thinnest smartphone to date, and for a phone made entirely of metal, it manages to stay pretty light at 151 grams. The A8 also carries some very thin side bezels, which helps make it more manageable in one hand in terms of width, but it's still a rather tall phone. The metal build and super thin profile of the A8 is an awesome combination, but despite how great it feels in the hand, it can still be pretty unwieldy at times, especially with such a large screen, and the smooth metal back is quite slippery, which makes the phone feel even less secure during one-handed operation. The buttons and ports are in identical locations to other Galaxy A devices, with the power button comfortably placed on the right, micro USB and 3.5mm headphone jack on the bottom, a single speaker mounted on the rear next to the camera, and volume buttons on the left, but they're choked up extremely high on the chassis, making them very uncomfortable and awkward to reach. Also on the left are dual SIM card slots, one of which doubles as a micro SD card slot for extra storage, and of course a Samsung device would not be complete without the typical home button and capacitive keys on the front. The screen on the A8 is a Super AMOLED panel that measures in at 5.7 inches, and the large size makes it great for movies, games, web browsing, and pretty much anything else you typically want to do on a phone. It's got all the characteristics that you would expect from a Samsung-made AMOLED screen, like great viewing angles, high brightness, good outdoor visibility, and vibrant saturated colors that makes the elements pop off the screen. It's a 1080p panel, which falls short of the Quad HD standard in today's current crop of flagships, but the A8 isn't a flagship, and most people will find 1080p to be more than enough for a screen on a phone. There's still plenty of sharpness and resolution to be had for a very enjoyable experience when reading text and various other content. Driving the everyday performance is the Qualcomm-made Snapdragon 615, a pretty common processor in the mid-range smartphone market. There's 2 gigs of RAM on board, and general everyday performance was pretty good and ran smoothly whether I was multitasking, browsing the web, or playing graphically intensive games. It does suffer from some home screen stutters every now and then, especially when scrolling in and out of Flipboard, but this was also a problem on the Galaxy S6, and Samsung hasn't done much to alleviate that problem on the A8. Otherwise, the A8 handles itself well, and in the grand scheme of things, the performance is on par with other smartphones that are similarly spec'd. Hardware-wise, the usual connectivity options like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, NFC, and LTE Cat 6 are all available, but it does not support 4G bands in the US. 3G data speeds, however, work just fine on T-Mobile and AT&T. The A8 comes in either 16 or 32 gigs of storage, with the option to expand up to an additional 128 gigs to store all of your media. Samsung also brought the fingerprint sensor of the S6 over to the A8, and it seems to work just as well as it does on the S6, unlocking the phone relatively quickly. The setup process is identical, utilizing a series of repeated presses until it completely captures your fingerprint, and you can store up to a maximum of 4 fingerprints at one time. Speaker quality from the rear mounted speaker isn't the best. It doesn't get very loud, so it can be very tough to hear in noisier environments, and being mounted on the rear certainly doesn't make it any better. It's also somewhat tinny and hollow sounding, so the media experience is definitely lacking, at least when it comes to great sounding audio. Despite how thin the A8 is, Samsung was able to pack a pretty large 3050 mAh battery inside, and battery life has been really good. Having that 1080p Super AMOLED screen definitely makes a difference here, and the phone also idles extremely well, losing only between 2 to 3% overnight. So even with heavy usage of a lot of gaming and YouTube watching, I was still able to squeeze out 4 hours of screen on time with over a day's worth of standby time, simply because of how well the phone idles. Now on a more normal day where I most mostly stuck to social media and web browsing. Screen on time reached upwards of almost 6 hours. So whether you're a heavy user or a light user, you really shouldn't have any problems with getting through a full day on this device. The camera on the rear is a 16 megapixel sensor just like the S6, but unlike the S6, the A8 utilizes ISOCELL technology instead of a Sony sensor, which means no optical image stabilization, but it does carry an aperture of f1.9. The front camera is a 5 megapixel wide angle lens that's actually capable of taking some pretty decent selfies, but the default beauty setting is a little aggressive, so you'll want to tone it down if you prefer a more natural looking image. The camera interface is mostly the same as what was introduced on the S6. It's a much cleaner, more simplified UI with only a few shooting modes like panorama, continuous shot, night, and a pro mode for full manual controls coming preloaded. But if you were a fan of Samsung's many other modes, you do have the option to download them all individually. The main difference is the absence of HDR auto, and the HDR toggle is buried within the rest of the shooting modes, making the experience of switching back and forth between HDR and auto mode a little bit clunky and slow. What isn't clunky and slow is the shutter speed. It's nice and quick, making it really easy to snap photos, and the resulting images are quite good. They're very sharp with plenty of detail, especially in above average lighting conditions, and there's still a good amount of clarity even when zoomed in. The images are colorful and saturated as you would expect from a Samsung camera, making for some very crisp and vibrant images. Dynamic range is already pretty good as is, but HDR, should you ever need it, does a great job at introducing some extra detail and color without appearing overexposed or unnatural. Even without OIS, the camera does really well in low light, and the f1.9 aperture obviously makes a huge difference here. Images still exhibit a nice amount of color and sharpness, and there's not a whole lot of noise reduction going on, which really helps maintain a respectable level of detail. For the software, the A8 is running the typical TouchWiz interface on top of Android 5.1.1 Lollipop. This is the much leaner, more revamped version of TouchWiz that we originally saw on the S6, so there's a lot less Samsung bloatware and unnecessary features, but because this particular review unit comes from SK Telecom, a carrier in Korea, there's quite a bit of SK Telecom apps pre-installed, most of which will probably be of no use to anyone using this device elsewhere. Samsung's more popular and arguably more useful features like multi-window for split-screen multitasking, and the smart gestures like palm swipe to capture a screenshot, or flipping the phone over to mute a phone call or alarm are all available on the A8. The new themes engine that was first introduced on the S6 is also included on the A8 to help you easily customize and change the overall look of the UI if you're not a fan of the blue and green TouchWiz color scheme, which I don't think very many people are. The theme store is constantly growing and is much more robust now than it was during its initial inception, and with so many different styles, you should be able to find at least a few that will suit your taste. The Galaxy A8 is currently available in select markets like China, India, and Korea, and if the release of previous A-series devices is any indication, it is highly unlikely that we'll see it coming to the States. The cost to import one through sites like eBay will run you upwards of $800, and at that point you're obviously better off buying a flagship like the S6 or the LG G4, or a device like the Idol 3, which offers a very comparable experience for a fraction of the cost. Overall, the A8 is a solid mid-range device that gets a lot of things right, like the build quality, camera, and battery life, but the price certainly puts the A8 in no man's land. Here in 2015, there's plenty of great mid-range devices that are hitting the sub $300 price point, and with flagships like the Moto X Style and OnePlus 2 on the horizon, the A8 isn't exactly a bargain. By no means do I think anyone would regret their purchase of the A8, but when looking at the current smartphone landscape, the A8 is certainly one tough pill to swallow. As always guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up down below. We definitely appreciate it. And also subscribe to the channel, which is also down below if you haven't already. And if you want to see more here from us at Android Authority, make sure to check out the links over here on the side. And feel free to follow me on any of my social media links. You'll see those around this area right here. And don't forget to check out the website as well, androidauthority.com, because we are your source for all things Android.